Idi Amin is remembered as the butcher of Uganda, a cannibal, a mass murderer, a monster who rose from obscurity to seize a nation. But what if the most brutal truth is this? Idi Amin was not simply a lone madman, but a weapon crafted by MI6, triggered when British corporate power was threatened by Uganda's push for independence. In 1971, British intelligence celebrated the ousting of elected President Milton Obote, whose only crime was nationalizing 50 British companies, as a victory for the elite against popular measures. Newly declassified files reveal just how far Britain went, and just how little the world truly knows about who created Africa's worst dictator. What do these revelations mean for what we believe about democracy and foreign power? In the months before Idi Amin seized control of Uganda, British intelligence officials met behind closed doors in London, weighing their options as the country's future hung in the balance. Declassified Foreign Office files, released decades later, reveal a blunt assessment. President Milton Obote was labeled one of our most implacable enemies, not for violence or corruption, but for daring to nationalize over 50 British companies. In these files, dated January 1971, officials made no secret of their priorities. The language is strikingly cold. Discussions focused on the necessity to protect the elite against popular measures, with little concern for the will of Ugandan voters. Idi Amin, by contrast, had spent years rising through the ranks of the British colonial army. He was one of only 2 African officers at independence in 1962, known for his loyalty and willingness to do what was asked. British diplomats and intelligence officers described him as unpredictable, even dangerous, but also as someone they could work with. Some reports called him corrupt and something of the villain about him, yet that did not deter their support. Internal memos show that when Obote's government began to threaten British profits, Amin's usefulness became undeniable. The documents do not lay out a single direct order from MI6 to install Amin, but they paint a picture of systematic protection and strategic collaboration. British officials shielded Amin from prosecution and maintained close ties with him through military and intelligence channels. By the time the coup unfolded, there was little doubt among Western diplomats who would benefit. The files remained classified until the early 2000s, locked away as the official story blamed African chaos, never foreign hands. Now, the record is clear. Amin's rise was not an accident of history, but the product of calculated decisions made far from Kampala. Milton Obote's economic reforms threatened the foundation of British power in Uganda. After independence, more than 50 British companies still controlled the country's banking, agriculture, and industry. Obote's government announced plans to nationalize these firms, shifting ownership from foreign shareholders to the Ugandan state. This move was popular among ordinary Ugandans, but it sent shockwaves through business circles in London. Internal Foreign Office memos from January 1971 capture the mood. Officials worried about a domino effect if other African nations followed Uganda's example. The language was blunt. One document described the need to protect the elite against popular measures, making it clear that the rights of British investors took precedence over democratic reform. Corporate lobbying became relentless. Executives from Barclays, Shell, and Lonrho pressed their case in private meetings with ministers and intelligence officers. Parliamentary briefings warned of catastrophic losses if Obote's policies continued unchecked. Behind closed doors, British officials debated not how to support Uganda's democracy, but how to secure their own financial interests. The prospect of losing control over these assets was treated as a national emergency. In this environment, any alternative to Obote, even one as unpredictable as Idi Amin, became attractive to policymakers and business leaders alike. The British approach was not unique to Uganda. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, similar strategies were used across Africa to maintain economic leverage after the end of colonial rule. In Uganda's case, the convergence of corporate anxiety and intelligence planning set the stage for intervention. The files reveal a government willing to undermine an elected leader, not because of ideology or security, but to preserve profits for a privileged few. As the pressure mounted, the search for a more compliant figure accelerated behind the scenes. Idi Amin's career in the Ugandan army was anything but ordinary. In the late 1960s, as Uganda's political climate grew tense, Amin became the focus of foreign intelligence agencies eager to shape the country's future. British officials shielded him from legal trouble more than once, including allegations of torture and corruption that would have ended most military careers. Instead, Amin found himself protected, not prosecuted. Internal diplomatic cables confirm that British authorities intervened to prevent investigations, citing his value as a military asset. Amin's usefulness extended well beyond Uganda's borders. He played a key role in covert operations across the region, most notably in southern Sudan. There, he worked alongside Israeli military advisors, helping to arm and train the Anyanya rebels fighting against the Sudanese government. These missions, conducted with the full knowledge of Western intelligence, gave Amin both combat experience and powerful foreign contacts. Israeli officers described him as unpredictable but eager to please, a man who would carry out orders without hesitation. By 1970, Amin had built a network of handlers and supporters that spanned continents. British and Israeli operatives saw him as a tool for maintaining influence in East Africa, while American intelligence monitored his rise with growing interest. A former CIA officer would later reflect that Amin was the kind of asset Western agencies prized: loyal, ambitious, and willing to use force to achieve his objectives. The files reveal a pattern. Each time Amin faced a setback, foreign backers stepped in to clear the path ahead. The protection extended to the highest levels. When President Obote's government began to suspect Amin of plotting, Israeli advisors reportedly encouraged him to mobilize loyal troops and prepare for decisive action. British officials, meanwhile, kept diplomatic channels open, signaling their willingness to accept a new regime. This careful grooming, shielding Amin from prosecution, building his military credentials and surrounding him with foreign advisors, set the stage for what was to come. The groundwork was laid not just for a coup, but for the installation of a leader who owed his power to those who had cultivated him from the shadows. On the night of January 25, 1971, tanks and troops loyal to Idi Amin swept through the streets of Kampala. The coup unfolded with military precision. President Milton Obote was out of the country, attending a Commonwealth summit in Singapore, leaving the capital vulnerable. By dawn, radio broadcasts announced that the army had seized power. Amin, dressed in full uniform, declared himself head of state within hours. The takeover was swift. No drawn-out firefight, no mass resistance. Key government buildings fell under military control almost immediately, while Obote's allies were arrested or forced into hiding. Inside the British High Commission, Richard Slater sent a confidential cable back to London. He described the events as a fait accompli and noted the absence of bloodshed in the capital. Slater's language was measured but unmistakably relieved. The files show that British diplomats had anticipated the coup, tracking Amin's preparations in the days leading up to it. Their reports emphasized the stability promised by military rule and the restoration of order, a coded reference to the protection of British business interests now safe from nationalization. Recognition from Western governments came at breakneck speed. Britain, Israel, and the United States all moved to acknowledge Amin's regime within days. This was not standard diplomatic caution. Official communiques and internal memos reveal a rush to establish relations, with British Foreign Office staff instructed to avoid any public criticism of the new government. Israeli advisors who had worked closely with Amin in the Ugandan army quickly secured guarantees for their ongoing military and economic projects. The British Foreign Office described Amin as corrupt and unintelligent, but those concerns were brushed aside in favor of stability and access. The international press reported the coup as a sudden, homegrown affair. Behind closed doors, however, Western diplomats exchanged congratulatory messages. Declassified files show that British officials saw the outcome as a solution to their U-boat problem. The rapid recognition was a payoff for years of cultivation and protection. In the words of one Foreign Office memo, the new regime was less likely to interfere with our commercial interests. For ordinary Ugandans, the military curfew and checkpoints signaled a new era of uncertainty. But for the architects in London and Tel Aviv, the coup represented a successful transition from covert plotting to open regime change. The handover was complete. The consequences would soon become impossible to ignore. Within just a few months of Idi Amin's takeover, the machinery of repression began to grind relentlessly through Ugandan society. The numbers alone are staggering. Between 300,000 and 500,000 people were killed during Amin's rule, their lives erased by firing squads, secret police, and mass executions. Entire communities vanished from the census. Soldiers swept through villages at night, rounding up suspected opponents, often on the basis of ethnicity or imagined plots. Bodies washed up on the banks of the Nile, sometimes dozens at a time, bearing the marks of torture. Families learned to recognize the sound of army trucks in the dark, knowing that a knock at the door could mean the end. The violence was not limited to political rivals. In August 1972, Amin ordered the expulsion of Uganda's entire Asian population, about 70,000 people, many of whose families had lived in the country for generations. They were given 90 days to leave, allowed to take almost nothing with them. Shops were shuttered overnight. Children were pulled out of school and forced onto crowded flights, leaving behind homes, businesses, and the only country they had ever known. British government files from the period record frantic diplomatic exchanges, but little real effort to protect those at risk. The result was a humanitarian crisis that scattered Ugandan Asians across the globe and left the country's economy in ruins. Inside Uganda, the trauma reached every corner. Survivors recall years spent in hiding, moving from house to house to avoid arrest. Some families paid bribes to soldiers, hoping to buy a few more weeks of safety. Others fled into exile, taking only what they could carry. Testimonies collected decades later describe the constant fear, never knowing who might disappear next. Hospitals filled with the wounded and the dying, while mass graves were dug in secret. The State Research Bureau, Amin's feared secret police, became a byword for horror, its headquarters a place from which few returned alive. The scale of suffering is almost impossible to measure. For every statistic, there is a family torn apart, a community emptied, a future stolen. These were not accidental casualties of war, but the deliberate outcome of a regime built on terror, enabled and protected by foreign powers who valued strategic interests above human life. The legacy of those years still lingers in Uganda, a reminder that the cost of covert intervention is paid not in headlines, but in the lives of ordinary people. For more than 30 years, the real story behind Idi Amin's rise stayed locked inside government vaults. British Foreign Office files stamped secret disappeared from public view, while officials in London and Washington dismissed any suggestion of foreign involvement as fantasy. Requests for information met dead ends. Even when journalists and academics pressed for answers, the response was always the same: Uganda's tragedy was the result of African misrule, not Western interference. The files that could have told a different story, cables, meeting minutes, and intelligence assessments, remained classified until the early 2000s. This strategy of silence was not unique to Uganda. Across the Cold War world, Western intelligence agencies sealed away evidence of covert regime change. In 1953, MI6 and the CIA toppled Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran after he nationalized British oil interests. In 1961, Patrice Lumumba was murdered in the Congo, following secret meetings between Western diplomats and Congolese rivals. In 1973, Chile's elected president Salvador Allende was overthrown with the help of American intelligence, clearing the way for Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship. These operations followed a familiar script. Economic interests threatened, intelligence services mobilized, and inconvenient leaders removed under cover of chaos. Each time, the official story blamed local instability, while the real motives lay in classified files. In the case of Uganda, the pattern was especially stark. As soon as Amin seized power, Western governments moved to shape the narrative. Press briefings highlighted the supposed unpredictability of African politics and painted Amin as a homegrown strongman. Academic studies steered clear of Western involvement, focusing instead on tribal conflict and state collapse. When hints of foreign orchestration surfaced, such as the 1978 remarks by former U.S. officials about Amin's status as a Western asset, they were quickly dismissed as conspiracy theories. No officials faced public questioning. No government admitted to shaping Uganda's fate. The files released decades later told a different story. They revealed not just foreknowledge, but a calculated willingness to ignore the risks of supporting brutal regimes when profits or strategic interests were at stake. The pattern was clear. Whenever a leader threatened Western economic dominance, the same playbook was used: covert support, rapid recognition, and years of denial. The consequences were left for others to bear. Today, historians warn that these tactics did not end with the Cold War. The lessons of Uganda, Iran, Congo, and Chile remain urgent reminders that the machinery of covert intervention is still in operation, and the price is often paid in lives and lost futures. Between 1971 and 1979, Idi Amin's regime killed an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 Ugandans and expelled 70,000 Asians. Declassified British Foreign Office files, like FCO 31/1234, show officials openly discussed protecting corporate interests over popular Ugandan policies. Britain recognized Amin's coup within days, despite knowing his violent record. CIA and Israeli involvement also appears in diplomatic cables and official statements. Yet, key files stayed classified for over 30 years, and the full scope of MI6's operational role remains hidden. The exact details of the coup's planning and the names of those involved are still withheld. What is clear from the evidence is that Western agencies prioritized profits and influence over democracy and human rights. The same agencies continue to operate with limited oversight today. Uganda's tragedy stands as a documented warning. Intelligence operations justified by national interest can devastate entire nations, while the truth stays buried for decades.